A burial from Newgrange in Ireland proves that the site was built for an elite stratum of Neolithic society. Or does it? A few years ago, a paper published in the journal Nature revealed the results of a genomic analysis of a bone from Newgrange that hinted at an incestuous relationship amongst a dynastic elite. However, a new piece of research argues that this was not the case after all. Ireland is famous for its megalithic monuments dating back more than 5,000 years. Some of the most noteworthy are the enormous passage tombs of Newgrange, Knowth and Duff, which collectively, alongside henges, standing stones and other burial mounds, became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1993. Newgrange was constructed around 3100 BCE and is made up of a large circular mound with an inner stone passageway and a cruciform-shaped chamber. It's surrounded by curbstones with various engravings and has a white quartz facade. A stone circle also surrounds the monument. The cruciform chamber contained burnt and unburnt human bones, as well as various artifacts that may have been grave goods or votive offerings. The entrance is aligned with sunrise on the winter solstice. On that morning, the sun shines through a roof box situated above the entrance and illuminates the chamber inside. Since Newgrange's discovery, the general consensus has been that it was a burial monument for a person or several persons with an elite status. This implies that a social hierarchy existed in Neolithic Ireland at that time. In 2020, an analysis of ancient DNA from a portion of a temporal unburnt bone discovered in the right-hand side recess of Newgrange's chamber revealed that it had belonged to an adult male who was the offspring of a first-order incestuous union. This means his parents were either full siblings or a parent and a child. This, together with other analyses of ancient DNA from passage tombs in Ireland that had found a shared genetic cluster, led researchers to suggest a dynastic elite had emerged in Ireland during the late Neolithic. The media picked this up, and the idea that a god king had been buried in Newgrange became popular. However, the team who have written this latest paper have their doubts about this social elite and kingly figurehead. To quote, "We recognise the enormous potential and contribution of aDNA for our understanding of Neolithic societies, but stress that rigorous science must also rely on rigorously interpreted archaeological evidence to provide valid narratives of the past." They carefully deconstruct the narrative that has emerged over the years, especially since the paper on the bone sample was published in 2020. The bone that was the subject of the 2020 paper is labelled as NG10. It was originally described as disarticulated cranial remains, but in a more recent paper in 2023, it was described as having belonged to a man who had been interred in the right-hand side recess of the chamber. This is relevant to the discussion because such a statement implies that this was the original burial location for the man, and a recess within a tomb could be considered as a prestigious place. The authors of the paper argue that since Newgrange was visited and disturbed many times by antiquarians, the place where the bone was discovered cannot be considered a secure context. Also, the old soil surface within the chamber was much disturbed by animal burrows, and the loose brown earth above this layer contained broken stones, burnt and unburnt bone, and 18 concentrations of commingled human and animal bone. This loose earth contained the remains of at least 5 individuals, but it was widely scattered and intermingled, so even though the bone concentrations were mentioned as being close to either the right or left recesses of the chamber, it's hard to be sure what the original context was. It's also not that likely that fully articulated bodies were interred there, since this is not how they were found, and it's not something that was common in Irish Neolithic mortuary practices. Most research points to mortuary practices having consisted of several stages, including excarnation, dismemberment, disarticulation, and cremation, with some bones then having been placed in tombs. In fact, no fully articulated human remains have been found in passage tombs so far, so it doesn't seem that specific individuals were remembered in this way. The idea that the individual who the bone NG10 belonged to had been interred in a special intentional way because of their social status and parentage may well be, as the authors of the paper put it, an interpretive leap. However, even if that particular adult male was not interred in a special and fully articulated way so that they were to be remembered in rituals, could they still have belonged to an elite class? Could all of the disarticulated bones have belonged to people of an elite social stratum? This entire idea revolves around passage tombs having been accessible only to a particular group. It implies that they held an exclusive status driven by their architectural complexity and the amount of labor that would have been required to construct them. The authors of the paper point out that the amount of labor involved is difficult to determine when the exact duration of construction isn't known. At that time, cattle traction had also become a feature of society, making such projects easier. A hierarchical society was not essential for such a building project to have been realized. Passage tombs were not built to a specific plan at one time either. They evolved in stages, so any social organization that may have taken place to facilitate their construction could have been temporary or just during peaks of activity. Also, if the elite were buried in monumental passage tombs, then this implies other people were interred in other types of tombs. However, there isn't enough data to determine whether this was the case or not. It's often argued that the chambers of Newgrange and similar monuments were accessible only to the elite, who had restricted knowledge of solar alignments. But this interpretation is also difficult to prove. Whether a stable elite stratum existed and whether their control was maintained through biological relatedness is still open to debate and not necessarily suggested by the tests on bone fragment NG10. The authors of the paper address the idea of hierarchy and elitism in Neolithic Ireland. There's no evidence that any particular selection process took place for burials in passage tombs in terms of sex, age, or physical ability. And the idea that if a selection process did take place in when the person was of high status relies on a number of assumptions. It associates such a person with control over other people and surplus resources, with an elite residence, and with exotic grave goods. But we actually don't know what social structures existed at the time. It could have been that both vertical and lateral societal relationships existed, and monumental construction projects could have been a way of preventing centralized power by concentrating everyone's efforts on a joint endeavor. Elaborate rich burials could have been a way to remove wealth and promote egalitarianism. The claim that the incest determined from the aDNA sample was likely socially sanctioned and an indicator of a dynastic elite is based on societies such as ancient Egypt, but does not look at places where it was practiced by non-elites. Also, it's the only example found in Neolithic Ireland and Britain. Most aDNA samples from these places point to an intentional avoidance of inbreeding. There's also no way of knowing if that particular case of incest was recognised or accepted, or whether it happened routinely within that society. So what do we know about life in Ireland between 3340 and 3020 BCE? Evidence from settlements shows that people lived in small domestic dwellings, which were quite the contrast to earlier oak, post and plank buildings. These earlier houses had foundation deposits and were intentionally destroyed when they were no longer in use. Such symbolism was not associated with later domestic buildings, but may have been transferred to the megalithic monuments instead. None of the domestic areas were defended, and there was no one building that was bigger than the others. There's also limited evidence for centralized storage and distribution. From 3600 BCE, the population in Ireland was quite mobile, with people moving around different parts of the island. This explains why the burial from Newgrange was related to burials at other passage tombs, and does not necessarily mean that they were all part of a dynastic elite. So none of this points to a complex hierarchical society. However, it doesn't necessarily mean it was egalitarian or that things didn't change over time. Overall, the authors of the paper advise against building a picture of prehistory based on certain assumptions. That's it. Thank you everybody for watching. Please hit the like button if you didn't already, and I'll see you next time.